The power does not disappear with a dramatic explosion. It fades first in small, almost forgettable ways. A brief flicker in the lights. A transformer humming louder than usual on a summer evening. A neighborhood substation going dark for 15 minutes before technicians quietly restore service. Most people treat these moments as ordinary inconveniences, but within the architecture of a national electrical grid, they can represent early stress signals inside one of the most complex machines humanity has ever built. Modern civilization depends on an invisible flow of electrons moving across thousands of miles of transmission lines, coordinated by automated control systems balancing supply and demand every second. When that balance begins to fail, the danger does not appear instantly. It builds quietly beneath the surface of daily life until one critical threshold is crossed. When that threshold breaks, the lights go out not just in a building or a neighborhood, but across entire regions. The danger of a power grid collapse is difficult for most people to grasp because electricity itself is invisible. Unlike a damaged bridge or a flooded street, electrical instability cannot be seen until its effects cascade into everyday systems. Homes lose lighting and heating, but that is only the surface layer. Beneath it, water treatment plants rely on electric pumps to maintain pressure. Hospitals depend on uninterrupted power for life support equipment. Fuel pipelines use electric compressors to move gasoline and diesel across hundreds of miles. Communication networks require electricity at every tower, switching center, and data hub. When the grid fails, these interconnected systems begin failing with it. The collapse of electricity is not simply darkness. It is the simultaneous disruption of the infrastructure that keeps cities alive. Understanding how a grid collapse occurs requires examining the physics behind electrical stability. At its core, the power grid is a synchronized network of generators spinning at extremely precise speeds. In most countries operating on a 60 Hz system, every turbine in every major power plant must rotate in near-perfect harmony, producing alternating current that oscillates 60 times per second. This synchronization allows electricity to flow smoothly across transmission lines from generators to consumers. But the system is delicate. If demand for electricity suddenly rises or supply drops unexpectedly, the frequency of the entire grid begins drifting away from its target. When the deviation becomes too large, protective systems automatically disconnect parts of the network to prevent catastrophic equipment damage. What begins as a minor imbalance can rapidly trigger a chain reaction of shutdowns spreading across the grid. Many people misunderstand blackouts as simple equipment failures. They imagine a single broken power plant or a damaged transmission line causing the outage. In reality, the most dangerous grid failures emerge from cascading effects inside the network itself. One overloaded transmission line shuts down to protect itself, forcing its electrical load onto neighboring lines. Those lines then become overloaded and shut down as well, shifting the burden further across the network. Within seconds, the system can fragment into isolated pockets unable to sustain stable power generation. When this fragmentation spreads across multiple states or regions, the blackout becomes widespread and extremely difficult to reverse. The hidden science behind these cascading failures lies in the relationship between electrical load and grid stability. Power systems operate close to their capacity during periods of high demand, especially during extreme weather when air conditioning or heating loads spike dramatically. Utilities manage this stress through sophisticated monitoring and control systems, constantly adjusting generator output to maintain balance. But these systems rely heavily on communication networks and automated responses. If several components fail simultaneously, perhaps a transmission line overheats during a heat wave while another line trips offline due to vegetation contact. The control system may not react quickly enough to prevent frequency instability. At that point, protective relays begin disconnecting sections of the grid in rapid succession. Evidence of this vulnerability has appeared repeatedly in modern history. In August of 2003, a massive blackout spread across parts of the northeastern United States and Canada, leaving more than 50 million people without power. Investigations later revealed that the event began with a handful of overloaded transmission lines brushing against untrimmed tree branches in Ohio. Those lines shut down, shifting electrical load across the grid until other lines became overloaded. Within minutes, The cascade accelerated beyond the ability of grid operators to contain it. Entire regions lost power in a chain reaction that demonstrated how fragile the balance of a modern electrical network can be. The survival implications of such events extend far beyond temporary inconvenience. When power disappears across a large metropolitan area, restoration is not as simple as flipping a switch. Electrical grids must be restarted carefully to avoid further instability. Large power plants cannot simply start generating electricity into a dead network. They require stable frequency and voltage conditions to synchronize with the grid. This means utilities must first energize small portions of the system using specialized black start facilities, generators capable of starting without external electricity. From there, technicians gradually reconnect transmission lines and power plants until the network becomes stable again. This process can take hours under ideal conditions, and much longer if infrastructure damage is widespread. Yet the misunderstanding most people carry is believing that blackouts are temporary by default. In everyday life, power outages usually last a few minutes or perhaps a few hours. But large-scale grid failures can persist for days or even weeks depending on the cause. Severe storms that damage transmission towers, widespread equipment failures during heat waves, or disruptions to fuel supplies for power plants can significantly delay restoration efforts. During that time, urban systems that rely on electricity begin to into elevated storage tanks. When power disappears, those pumps stop working. Initially, water pressure may continue for several hours as gravity feeds the system from storage tanks. But once those reserves are depleted, taps begin running dry. Without electricity, water treatment processes also halt, raising the risk of contamination if untreated water enters the system. Another misunderstood vulnerability lies in food supply chains. Modern grocery stores maintain minimal backroom storage because deliveries arrive frequently from centralized warehouses. Refrigeration systems keep perishable food safe, but those systems require continuous electricity. During extended blackouts, refrigerators and freezers begin warming within hours. Stores quickly close, both because payment systems fail and because food safety cannot be guaranteed. Residents who assume they can purchase supplies during an outage often discover empty shelves within a single day. Hidden within these cascading effects is the reality that modern cities are not designed for prolonged electrical silence. The infrastructure assumes continuous energy flow. When that assumption fails, every dependent system begins operating on borrowed time. Emergency generators exist in hospitals, water plants, and some government facilities. But these generators depend on fuel deliveries that may become difficult if transportation networks are disrupted by the blackout itself. Evidence from past disasters shows how quickly this situation can escalate. During the 2012 Hurricane Sandy blackout affecting parts of New York and New Jersey, millions lost power for days. High-rise buildings without electricity left residents climbing dozens of flights of stairs to reach apartments. Fuel shortages developed as gas stations could not pump fuel without generators. Communication networks struggled as cellular towers exhausted their backup batteries. Each hour without power increased pressure on emergency services attempting to stabilize the situation. The survival implications become increasingly clear when examining how households respond to extended outages. Many families are unprepared for even a few days without electricity. Cooking appliances rely on electric ignition systems. Heating systems require electric blowers or circulation pumps. Even homes with natural gas connections may lose functionality if the control electronics lose power. Refrigerated food spoils, forcing families to rely on whatever shelf-stable supplies they happen to have available. Yet another layer of vulnerability emerges in communication infrastructure. While smartphones and internet services appear resilient during normal operations, they are deeply dependent on the electrical grid. Cellular towers typically contain backup batteries designed to operate for several hours after power loss, but those batteries eventually deplete unless generators are available. Once those systems shut down, large populations lose access to digital information and emergency alerts simultaneously. The blackout transforms not only the physical environment but also the information landscape people depend on for guidance. As darkness spreads across the affected region, the psychological impact begins amplifying the physical disruption. Humans are accustomed to illuminated cities where electricity flows continuously. When entire urban skylines fall dark, uncertainty spreads quickly. People search for news, attempt to contact relatives, and begin making decisions based on incomplete information. Traffic increases as residents attempt to reach stores, gas stations, or relatives' homes before conditions worsen. This is the moment where the blackout stops being a technical failure and becomes a social stress test. Because when millions of individuals simultaneously realize that electricity may not return soon, behavior begins shifting in ways that place additional pressure on already strained systems. And once that shift begins, another critical phase of grid collapse survival emerges. One that has nothing to do with power plants or transmission lines, but everything to do with how human populations react when the energy that sustains modern life suddenly disappears. When a city loses power across a large area, the first hour feels confusing but manageable. People assume restoration crews are already working and that electricity will return soon. Elevators stop, traffic lights go dark, and buildings fall silent, except for the distant sound of emergency generators starting in hospitals or industrial facilities. But as the second and third hours pass, the underlying structure of urban systems begins revealing how deeply electricity is embedded in everyday life. Refrigeration systems warm slowly, payment networks go offline, and water pressure begins fluctuating as pumping stations switch to limited backup power or shut down entirely. The danger is not immediate catastrophe, but a gradual unraveling of services that normally operate so reliably that most residents never consider how fragile their continuity actually is. From an engineering perspective, this phase marks the transition from electrical failure into systemic stress. Infrastructure networks operate in layers, and electricity sits at the foundation of many of them. When that foundation disappears, each dependent system begins entering contingency mode. Wastewater treatment plants, for example, rely on electric motors to aerate water and move sewage through filtration systems. When those motors stop, untreated wastewater can begin accumulating inside pipelines and holding tanks. Emergency generators may temporarily sustain these operations, but they depend on fuel reserves that are often designed for short-term outages rather than prolonged blackouts. If the outage extends beyond those reserves, the sanitation infrastructure that protects public health begins deteriorating rapidly. The misunderstanding most people carry during this stage is believing that modern cities have extensive backup systems ready to replace the grid indefinitely. In reality, emergency generators exist primarily to maintain critical operations for limited periods. Hospitals, data centers, and water plants typically maintain fuel supplies designed to last between 24 and 72 hours depending on consumption rates. Beyond that window, continuous operation requires resupply from fuel deliveries. Yet those deliveries depend on functioning transportation networks and operational fuel terminals, many of which also require electricity to pump and distribute fuel. A prolonged blackout, therefore, creates a feedback loop where the very systems needed to maintain emergency power begin failing because the grid itself is gone. The hidden science behind this cascading degradation involves the concept of infrastructure interdependency. Modern urban systems are not isolated technologies operating independently. They are tightly integrated networks relying on each other for stability. Electricity powers water treatment, water supports fire suppression systems, transportation networks deliver fuel to power generators, and communication systems coordinate emergency responses. When the electrical grid fails, these interdependencies transform what might appear to be a single technical outage into a multi-system crisis that spreads through the entire urban environment. Evidence for this pattern has been documented repeatedly in disaster research. Studies conducted by the U.S. Department of Energy and several European infrastructure resilience programs show that extended power outages trigger secondary disruptions within hours. Telecommunications networks begin losing coverage as cellular towers exhaust battery backups. Fuel distribution slows as gas stations without generators cannot pump gasoline or diesel. Electronic payment systems fail, preventing transactions even in stores that still have inventory. Within a single day, the functioning of a modern city begins shifting from automated digital systems toward improvised manual processes. The survival implications during this phase are often underestimated because the environment initially appears calm. Streets remain structurally intact, buildings still stand, and the absence of visible damage creates the illusion that the situation is temporary. Yet beneath that calm surface, critical timelines are unfolding. Refrigerated food in grocery stores begins reaching unsafe temperatures after several hours without cooling. Residential refrigerators follow a similar pattern, with internal temperatures rising slowly but steadily. If the blackout extends beyond a day, large volumes of perishable food across an entire city may spoil simultaneously, eliminating a major source of household nutrition. Water availability becomes another growing concern. Even if municipal water continues flowing initially, the loss of electrical pumping capacity gradually reduces system pressure. In high-rise buildings, water may stop reaching upper floors first because pumps that maintain vertical pressure are offline. Residents carrying water up stairwells in dark buildings quickly discover how physically demanding this task becomes, particularly for elderly individuals or families with children. As pressure drops further, entire neighborhoods may experience dry taps, forcing residents to search for alternative sources. Another overlooked effect involves fuel logistics within urban transportation systems. Many cities operate with relatively small on-site fuel reserves for emergency vehicles. Police departments, ambulance services, and utility repair crews depend on fuel deliveries to maintain extended operations. During a prolonged blackout, fuel terminals that normally supply these vehicles may struggle to operate if their own electrical systems are compromised. The evidence for how quickly these pressures accumulate appeared during the 2003 Northeast blackout. Although electricity was restored to most regions within 2 days, the event revealed vulnerabilities that emergency planners had not fully anticipated. Water systems in several cities experienced declining pressure. Traffic congestion intensified as drivers attempted to navigate intersections without signals. Cellular networks struggled under the surge of call attempts as millions tried contacting family members simultaneously. The blackout did not destroy infrastructure physically, yet the loss of electricity alone created widespread operational instability. From a survival standpoint, one of the most critical resources during a prolonged blackout becomes information. People want to know how long the outage will last, which areas are affected, and whether essential services will continue operating. Yet the blackout itself gradually removes the tools people rely on to obtain that information. Television networks lose broadcasting capability without backup power. Internet connectivity disappears as local routers and data centers shut down. Smartphones eventually become useless once batteries drain and cellular networks go offline. This progressive isolation leaves many residents relying on word-of-mouth reports or sporadic radio broadcasts to understand what is happening. The psychological effects of this information vacuum should not be underestimated. Human beings rely heavily on situational awareness to make rational decisions during crises. When accurate information disappears, uncertainty fills the gap. People begin speculating about causes, timelines, and risks. Rumors spread quickly through neighborhoods and social circles, sometimes exaggerating the severity of the situation. This uncertainty drives behavior changes that can place additional strain on infrastructure systems already under pressure. For example, as residents become unsure about how long the blackout will last, many begin attempting to secure additional supplies. Grocery stores that remain open without electricity may experience sudden surges of customers attempting to purchase bottled water, canned food, or batteries. Yet without functioning payment systems, stores often resort to cash transactions or close entirely. This creates tension among residents who fear resources may run out. Even when supplies remain available elsewhere, the perception of scarcity can trigger panic purchasing that empties shelves faster than normal consumption would. Another escalation appears in transportation patterns. With traffic signals offline, intersections become hazardous points where drivers must negotiate passage manually. In dense urban environments, this often leads to congestion or accidents that block critical routes. Emergency responders attempting to reach hospitals or utility facilities may encounter significant delays navigating these conditions. The blackout therefore begins interfering not only with civilian movement but also with the operations required to restore stability. As night falls during a widespread power outage, the environment changes dramatically. Cities accustomed to constant illumination suddenly become dark landscapes where only scattered generator-powered lights remain visible. Street lighting disappears, leaving many neighborhoods illuminated only by vehicle headlights or handheld flashlights. This darkness increases the risk of accidents and complicates emergency response operations. It also contributes to a heightened sense of vulnerability among residents who are unfamiliar with navigating their environment without artificial lighting. Yet perhaps the most critical turning point arrives when the blackout extends beyond the first 24 hours. At that moment, the assumption that power will return quickly begins fading. Households start realizing that food preservation, water storage, communication, and personal safety must be managed without relying on the infrastructure that normally supports them. What began as a temporary inconvenience evolves into a survival challenge requiring preparation, planning, and resource management. This realization forces individuals and families to confront an important question. How prepared are they to operate independently from the electrical grid? Because the difference between inconvenience and crisis often comes down to whether basic necessities, clean water, safe food, light, communication, and temperature control, can be maintained without continuous power. And as the blackout stretches deeper into multiple days, the focus of survival shifts again, moving away from immediate infrastructure failures toward the long-term realities of living in an environment where the central energy system that powers modern civilization has simply stopped.